Jesus was perfect. Even the people who hated him, you have to understand, the people who wanted him dead were the Sanhedrin. They were the Pharisees and Sadducees, the legal experts of their time. They knew the Old Testament like the back of their hand.
Well,
They
even Pontius Pilate said he could not find any
couldn't
fault in
find any
him.
fault in
Yep.
him. They were bringing in false witnesses. They were breaking their own laws, trying to get him onto the cross. They could not find a fault in him. And they had people watching him constantly, testing him constantly. And he was always spinning it around on them just like that. How does this guy learn this stuff? Where did he get? He hasn't been educated in our rabbinical schools. Where's this? Yeah, well, you're trying to get an angle on God. It ain't gonna happen.
Right.
And in the end, they killed an innocent man, and but it had to happen, right? The Old Testament says the only thing that
And
will
that's
square your sin against your rebellion against God
mhm.
is blood. The
I
problem
think that
is,
that's really where we need to move this conversation as well as into prophecy. You know,
yeah,
because that's I mean that for me was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to belief. Because I had this kind of coming out of school and everything, I kind of had this weird perspective on Christianity
yeah,
for a while, and it
the
was
university got a little bit
a
of a
little
hook
bit of
in
a
your
hook in there.
head.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But that aside, I think it was really when I started looking at prophecy, things fell into place, and it fell into place in a way that was so perfect that it couldn't have happened any other way. And I think that was something that really, really just opened up my heart to God, because I couldn't understand how so many people could collaborate on a work like the Bible
60,
across time. I mean, do these people have time machines or something?
60
And at the same
authors,
time,
60 authors, 66 books, 4,000
yep,
years.
4,000 years.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that these people are not collaborating on this work to create a such a perfect depiction of Christ from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Everything points to Jesus in that. It's incredible. I mean, you can go and look at some of the old Christophanies. You can look at the order of Melchizedek. There's just so much packed into both the Old and the New Testament that points to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, if you look at things like when they were building, I used to look at the Old Testament like, what is all of this
Right.
stuff? I don't get it. It's like,
And a lot of people tried to push it aside and be like, "Oh, that's the Old Testament. We're going to throw out the Old
yeah.
Testament. Here's the New Testament.
And
This is what you should be believing."
even I was like that. Like, that's just alien stuff for the Jewish people. I don't even know what that is. And then I started studying it. And I'll give you an example, right? Okay, so they had instruction from God. You're going to build it like this. It gave them exact detail on size and
For the
what
temple, you mean?
for the temple.
Yep.
Everything they were going to use, how they were going to use it was all exact instruction from God to Moses. And things like covering things with gold. It wasn't about the value of the gold,
It was
right?
about the
It was
symbolism.
about the rarity and its purity.
Mm.
It wasn't like they were going to take hey, God, I got to go get some more supplies. I'm going to take this golden plate and run down to the store and get. No, it was for that purpose. It was purified. It was sacred.
Sanctified.
It was highly valuable for its function. But I'm going to take the issue of the altar, okay, because the altar, right, is
Mhm.
built of acacia wood. It's covered in bronze, and and that's where the animals were sacrificed on that altar.
Right.
And so, of course, the lambs and every one of those sacrifices were symbolic of Christ's future sacrifice.
For the crucifixion.
They were supposed to take the blood and sprinkle it on the people, which is supposed to be the foreshadowing,
And
right,
the way
for
that they dealt
atonement,
with the corpse afterwards,
not allowing any of it to
yep.
decay.
Yep.
Right. All of those things pointed to, and yet the more I study it, the more clear it becomes that that's what it was. The altar is the foreshadowing of the cross, right? Christ was sacrificed on the
On the
cross.
cross, which they also said was probably made of acacia wood, because it was the only real large timber wood that would have been available
There were a
in the
few,
region.
but it was the heaviest, and we know
Yep.
from Roman writings that it was one of the few trees that they could actually build straight beams out of to build a
Right.
cross, and that from Roman writings, not necessarily biblical ones, but that the cross probably weighed around 300 pounds.
Wow.
So Jesus was carrying the cross beam, which in and of itself was probably 150 pounds.
Right.
And then probably somebody else was carrying the lower half of it, and they would fit one into the other. but yeah, likely it was acacia wood, the same thing
The same thing that
the
they made the
altar
altar
was
of.
built out of. So little details like that.
Mhm.
And now I'm starting to really drill down and find things because I'm starting to study like cuneiform writing and the cuneiform stories. And the reason is because you think about it, when the ark rested, it was in Mount Ararat. That was the northwestern end
Mhm.
of the Mesopotamian crescent or fertile valley that ran between the Tigris and Euphrates River, all the way from the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Arabia.
And they had a story that came out a while back about, actually finding remnants of what they believe was the ark on the side of that
Yeah, they
mountain, right?
actually found what they call the Ark tablet, written in cuneiform. Yeah,
Yep.
written in cuneiform, and it talks about this guy. They give him a different name, but it's Noah,
Yep.
and how he had to build a boat, but the boat was round.
Right.
But there's all of these different directions about how he's supposed to build a boat. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, those directions in cuneiform don't match those directions that Moses wrote down. Well, so what? Right? It's like, okay, well, maybe it was built that way, or maybe it was built that way. That's not the issue. You
Yeah.
have two totally different
Well, I think a
removed
lot of it came down to cubits, right? Because they'd say that the cubit was like the length of the distance of someone's
the
forearm,
elbow to the tip of the
elbow
finger.
to the tip of the finger,
Yeah,
and some people measured it from the elbow to like
but
the pinky finger or something like that.
yeah,
And
but
so,
the point is the Babylonians have a flood story,
right,
and they give a dimension of like 3,600 square yards with 6 stories. And if you think about it, a round boat would not need to have a side. It just has to float until it doesn't.
yep.
And that it's the same figure is in the boat to survive this massive flood. Also in the book, The Bible is History, they did archaeology 600 miles inland from the Mediterranean uh, in uh, in Asia Minor, and they dug down and they found bronze level stuff. And below bronze level, there was 6 feet of marine clay and sediment. And then when they got through the 6 feet of marine clay and sediment, they found Stone Age implements. So you have Stone Age implements, 6 feet of marine clay, and then you have Bronze Age implements, 600 miles inland from the
And
Mediterranean.
then you also have, all manner of creatures and other fossils and things through those layers of sediment at the same time. So,
Right.
the only way that that happens is if you had some kind of a major flood.
Right. And some people think the Strait of Gibraltar at one point was probably a big depression kind of
Right.
an area, and at some point maybe something broke there at the Strait of Gibraltar, and then that caused the ocean to flood into the
So again, the
Mediterranean,
Bible
caused
being
tidal waves.
used as history,
Right.
more or less.
Yeah. But more interestingly, is I was digging in, and I realized, so for example, Gilgamesh, right? We
Hmm.
talked about Gilgamesh before. In cuneiform, Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk.
King of Uruk, yeah.
Uruk, and Uruk is one of the most ancient cities known. I think it's even older than Ur, and Ur was one of the. Yeah, I remember that we discovered Ur. I don't remember how long ago, like 50 years ago or something. But Uruk's even older, and they think that Uruk was probably where Nimrod ruled from.
Hmm.
But uh, if you examine, there's the Book of Giants. There's a giant named Gilgamesh, who is supposedly the grandfather of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh in the story is said to be a giant.
Hmm.
So there's a connection there. Well, in the book of so you have ancient cuneiform matching up with ancient Hebrew, right? And then you find when you go back to Genesis that Abraham came out of Ur. Well, Ur is a rock's throw from Uruk. They're right in the same place, and that whole area around there was where the sons of Arphaxad had settled. If you look at the diagrams for that area, so you had Arphaxad settling right there,
Right.
Ur and Uruk, and then across from them Elam, which became Acadia, and so both uh, Abraham and Gilgamesh were both from the line of Shem through Arphaxad, because they both lived and proximal to each other,
Right.
like in the same time period. Like, I mean, maybe they could have bumped into each other or had a conversation or
Right.
something. So that's pretty fascinating. So
Well, not
now,
only that, but you also take into consideration, the Bible having a very clear. Sorry about the mic there. I was probably keying people. It's very clear that there were references to giants, being in certain lands outside of
Well,
where
yeah,
people were
Canaan.
to go. Canaan, the land of Canaan,
Yeah.
was supposed to be filled with giants.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have references, back in Genesis to the Nephilim and
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. So obviously there's very clear distinction there. And I think it's worth noting that, the book of Giants is not in the Bible. The book of Enoch is not in the Bible. Those are what would you call
Well, they would
those? Like
call them
Kabbalistic
extra. They
Bibles?
would call them extra biblical sources,
Extra
but
biblical.
you have to remember that when they put the Bible together, they did not have the Book of Enoch.
Right.
They did not have the Book of Jasher or the Book of Giants. Those things were discovered in Qumran in 1946, 47, and they were pulling stuff out of there as fast. It was like a race to get everything
Right.
out of there, but they discovered an almost complete Book of Giants and almost complete Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch was actually discovered by a Scotsman back in 1725, I think, in Ethiopia. Then he brought it back and did an English translation on it, and everybody went, I don't think so. Where'd you get this? Ethiopia. But you got to remember that the Queen of Sheba was from Ethiopia. She visited Solomon. They were good friends. She went back with a whole bunch of stuff. I'm sure she had a pile of copied papers and scriptures and stuff. So it does make sense that they would have that in Ethiopia. But when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, all that stuff got burned up. And I think the only stuff that was existing was stuff in the synagogues. But as far as it being an extra biblical source, you have to remember that both Peter and Jude quote the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe not the Book of Giants, but the Book of Giants actually jives with what you see in the Book of Enoch and what you read in Genesis. So
Right.
there's nothing that precludes it from being correct information.
Right.
Something happened to mankind. There was a genetic tampering where you ended up with, and remember, the word giant can actually be translated earth dwellers, but
Right.
there seems to be plenty of suggestion that they were big guys. I don't think they were 300 feet tall or anything, but I
Well,
think
there was
they
the
were.
reference somewhere. I can't remember exactly where it
It says
was about.
mighty men and heroes of
Right.
old. So I think what you had was great, big, super strong guys that nobody could beat, and they became king out of pure strength.
Probably even bigger than me. I'm
And
a pretty big guy. I'm like 6'4" and 300 some odd pounds. But the I guess what I'm getting at here is that that's a genetic thing. That's something that crosses the barriers of time. In terms of you and not only that, but there's a reference about having multiple fingers and multiple
six
sets of
fingers,
teeth,
2 rows of teeth.
two rows of
Yeah.
teeth. I can't remember where that comes from. If that, I don't want to try and say that it's
Well,
biblical if it's
I
not.
think that some of that comes from ancient writings, and some of it's actually been purported to have been from archaeological finds in the U.S.
But what's interesting about it is that there is something in human genealogy called polydactylism, which allows for people to have more than one finger.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something in, dentistry specifically that allows for multiple rows of teeth.
Right.
And if those things were alive in our genealogy somewhere in history, and then we had the conversation earlier about DNA and about things not being able to come out in DNA sequences unless they were there in the first place. Well,
Right.
you trace things back. You might have people who are 8 feet tall, 20 feet tall with double rows of teeth
Well,
and six fingers.
it seems like that where these people with these traits were concerned was that they were particularly brutal
and
and
possibly evil. Yeah.
and so that there may actually be some manner of evil attached to the gene.
Right. And so one of the greatest questions that people always ask is, well, if that's the case and the flood came through and wiped everything out, how did giants survive? A lot of people don't realize, one, there's a Kabbalistic story about a giant like actually clinging to the side of the ark, right?
Right.
And then there's another one.
Well, I think that it came through Ham's wife.
Yeah, that's very.
And the
big
reason I
possibility.
say that is because it wasn't Ham that did something to Noah; it was Canaan, and it may not have been Noah he did it to. It might have been his wife, and
You're talking about the revealing of nakedness and
right, the
yeah.
revealing of nakedness. So he did something perverted, and maybe it was something as simple as going in there and pulling the sheets off his grandma, who probably looked like she was 40, by the way.
Yeah.
Probably not unattractive. Not like we think grandma, like and wrinkled up. She lived a long time, so she probably was still still young and
But
attractive.
again, and this is a family coming out of a very, very evil time.
Out of a very evil time. So much so that it had to be destroyed. So she has a child, and the child does something evil, and that child, which is Canaan, gets cursed. And then when you go to look at the offspring of the Canaanites, there's two things: giantism and perversity, like you would not want to even mention in polite conversation. When God had to sit the Israelites down before they went into Canaan and gave them rules. Don't sleep with your parents. Don't sleep with your sister. Don't sleep with your aunt. Don't sleep with animals. Don't sleep with other men if you're a guy, or women if you're a woman. Don't drink blood.
Right.
It's like, and you're thinking as you're reading this, like,
why would you need to say those things?
Why would you need? Because that's what those people were doing, and they were about to go in there and wipe them out. So God was prepping them early on, remember, because a whole generation died in the desert. So he had a fresh generation that had been raised from babies as, you don't do these things. These things are an abomination. They're appalling.
Right.
And that's why you're going to go in there and take that land. And so then when they went in there and they saw those things, they weren't like, ooh, this is interesting. They were like, and they were burning places down. And I think it bothers me, because some people were like, oh yeah, well, what about when God told the Israelites go in there and kill all those people and take their land? And I'm like, you know what kind of people those were? Even then, you have to look at things from God's perspective, not man's perspective.
It's also worth noting that there wasn't this covering of blood that we have through Jesus at that point in time either. And so God's wrath is pretty definitive if you go back to the Old Testament, and I think that's a very big delineation to make as well. You have to look at where we are today versus where we were back then.
And how long did he let it go for?
Yeah.
The Israelite, look, he had to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because this massive gang of guys showed up to gang rape two guys who just rolled into town.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like, that's the kind of stuff that was going on. It was violence. And so he let it, he gave them 450 years to turn it around.
I think honestly we're quickly approaching the Sodom and Gomorrah level
when the Israelites came in and mowed over the Canaanites, they had it coming.
Right.
They had it coming. They were a bad group of people. They were as bad as humanity gets.
Yeah.
What Sodom and Gomorrah was, they eventually all became.
Right.
And that's why they were driven out. But there were giants there, and they were the offspring of Canaan. So there was something about Canaan, I think, in his genetics, because probably of his mom was probably carrying it, and that spread throughout Canaan. Here's the other thing. What if he hadn't have wiped the Canaanites out and they had started to spread out?
Yeah.
Then what would have happened? Because I don't think the people up in the Mesopotamian River Valley was doing the stuff they were doing.
Right.
And neither were the Egyptians. I mean, these people were off the hook.
Well, not only that, but you consider, the potential for conquest, from let's say that you had an entire, a tribe of giants, and they were roaming the hills and taking land over and crushing people. What are you going to do about it? These people are basically monsters compared to you in a lot of respects. And I would think that that'd be pretty intimidating if you had to even face one of these things. But that aside, I think we're kind of getting way off track and talking about giants and stuff. But, one of the things I did want to bring up is just because, someone has polydactylism or, multiple sets of teeth or anything does not mean that you're evil. One, I think that it's important to recognize that you might be. But I think it's important that we understand that we are human, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that above all else, we're human. We are God's creatures. We are trying to come back to that light. We're trying to redeem ourselves.
And nobody, I don't think there's anybody out there that's so evil that they can't be forgiven if they turn to God.
Right.
I mean, you might think you've done some really horrible things in your life.
And that there is the message of redemption and hope for everyone who's listening. I think that there is the important takeaway from the conversations that we're going to be having, going into the future. I think that people just need to hear that message of hope. They need to hear that it's not hopeless. It's not
that you do have meaning. And
you do have meaning,
purpose,
and life God does exist,
and life doesn't end.
Yeah, amen.
It doesn't end, even if you want it to. It's going to go on.
going to go on.
You just have to decide which side of the field you're going to be on.